The war had been over for 11 days. Or, more accurately, it had been declared over 11 days ago. The Vareth Dominion's Victory Fleet now hung in low orbit, above the shattered remains of Callisto's moon, its fractured mass still slowly rotating, like a broken monument to resistance. Golden hulls reflected distant starlight with ceremonial precision. Sensor arrays drifted across the debris field below, not in urgency, but in habit, as if confirming every few hours that reality had not changed its mind. It hadn't. There was nothing left that qualified as a threat. The human defensive line had collapsed in 48 hours of coordinated Dominion advance. Entire fortress stations positioned at Jupiter's L4 and L5 points now drifted silently as expanding fields of wreckage, their once imposing silhouettes reduced to cold geometry and drifting fragments. The last organized human carrier group had withdrawn from the system 6 days ago, badly damaged, barely functional, and no longer relevant to Dominion calculations. Since then, the system had been quiet. Too quiet for most commanders to remain fully relaxed, but not quiet enough to justify concern. So they called it peace. On the bridge of the lead Dominion vessel, tactical readouts continued to cycle through automated confirmation loops. Enemy presence, none. Resistance probability, 0. Containment status, complete. Everything, according to doctrine, was finished. And yet, somewhere in the debris field below Callisto, instruments that had been silent for 11 days were about to register a change no Dominion officer had been trained to expect. Not a threat returning. But something deciding it had never left. Breath had swept the battlefield with methodical precision, cataloging their prizes, towing intact vessels to their trophy docks. Commander Vextharian stood at the observation deck of the Eternal Sovereign, the Dominion's flagship, and looked out at the greatest prize of the campaign, the UES Leviathan. She was ancient by the standards of any spacefaring race, over 400 years old. The humans had laid her keel in 2008, in the earliest and most desperate years of their push into the outer system. She was enormous, nearly 3 kilometers long, all brutal angles and layered armor plating. Her hull scorched black by centuries of service. Her design was primitive compared to breath vessels, utilitarian in the way only humans seem to prefer their instruments of war. Ugly, purposeful, and inexplicably difficult to kill, she had survived the Martian Rebellion of 2143, the Kepler War, the Siege of Europa, and 4 separate decommissioning orders that had all been quietly reversed. When one crisis or another erupted, and humanity found they needed the old monster again, she had finally been caught in the opening salvo of the breath assault, hit by 9 successive plasma lance strikes before her engines failed. She drifted now 200 kilometers from the Sovereign, her lights dark, her gun ports sealed, her hull venting cold gas from a 100 microractures. The breath battle cataloger, a thin, many-limbed creature named Overi, approached Commander Theon with his datapad. Confirmed designation, UES Leviathan Registry Earth Defense Force Commission, year 2089. The oldest human warship, still on active deployment at the time of capture. The Admiralty Council has confirmed she is to be the centerpiece of the Dominion's Hall of Conquered Peoples on the homeworld. Theon allowed himself a slow, satisfied smile. The Hall of Conquered Peoples was the greatest museum in breath space. 47 races, their artifacts, their ruins, the physical evidence of the Dominion's expansion across 800 light-years. And now humanity would join them, their oldest ship displayed for eternity, a monument to their defeat. Boarding team? Theon asked. Over made a small gesture, the breath equivalent of a dismissive shrug. Engineering scouts confirmed no power signature, no life support active. The ship reads as completely dead. Tau drones are attaching now. We have scheduled a symbolic boarding ceremony for the Admiralty records. 2 soldiers to plant the Dominion flag on the bridge, largely ceremonial. He paused. Though one of the scouts did note some anomalous thermal readings in the lower decks, very faint, almost certainly residual heat from the plasma impacts. The ship's reactor vented, but did not fully dissipate. Theon considered this for less than a second. Almost certainly, he repeated. Yes, Commander. He turned back to the window. The Leviathan drifted in silence, dark and massive, and utterly still. Every sensor sweep confirmed the same story. No power, no crew, no threat. Thion had been fighting humans for 6 years. He knew they were stubborn, creative, and dangerously unpredictable when cornered. But even he did not consider in that moment what it meant that no human had ever, not once in 400 years, let the Leviathan leave a battlefield without her crew. In the deep dark of Deck 7, Section 9, behind 3 airtight blast doors that had been manually sealed from the inside, in a compartment that didn't appear on any official schematic because it had been welded into the hull by a chief engineer in 2271 as an unauthorized modification that no one had ever gotten around to removing, 43 people were breathing slowly, carefully, sharing oxygen scrubbers and body heat, wrapped in emergency thermal blankets, not moving, not talking, running on emergency power so minimal that their biosignatures registered as background noise. 43 crew members, led by a woman with a broken collarbone, a lieutenant commander's insignia, and the kind of patience that only came from 4 generations of a family that had served on the same ship. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Voss pressed her back against the cold bulkhead, closed her eyes, and counted her heartbeats. She had been counting for 11 days. She could wait a little longer. The Leviathan had not always been Sarah's ship. She had been born on it. That was perhaps the more accurate way to say it. Her great-grandmother, Petty Officer First Class Marin Voss, had served in the Leviathan's engine room during the Kepler War, a brutal, grinding 2-decade conflict fought across the asteroid belt against a Terran separatist faction that had allied itself with what was then called the Vela Syndicate. Marin had died when Sarah was 3, a small, sharp-eyed woman who smelled of engine grease and kept a fragment of hull plating from the ship on her mantelpiece. The Leviathan doesn't die, she had told little Sarah once in a voice that allowed for no argument. She gets hurt, she bleeds, but she doesn't die, and neither do her people. Sarah's grandmother, Elena Voss, had served as a gunnery officer. Her mother, Commander Kira Voss, had been the Leviathan's first officer for 8 years before being promoted to a station command, and Sarah herself had requested the posting at 23 over the objections of 3 admirals who thought it was unhealthy to be quite that attached to a single vessel. She had served on the Leviathan for 14 years. She knew every sound her hull made, every vibration pattern of her ancient engines, every quirk of her jury-rigged life support, and her patched and repatched reactor shielding. She had also, unlike most officers in the Earth Defense Force, read every damage report and after-action file the ship had ever generated, all 412 years' worth. And she had noticed something buried in the engineering logs from the 2271 refit, authorized by a chief engineer named Dawsamani, who had apparently been a man of deep suspicion and deeper paranoia, was a compartment. The schematics listed it as a collapsed storage bay, inaccessible, scheduled for removal, that had never occurred. In reality, Imke had quietly expanded it, reinforced it, installed a passive air recycling system, drawing off waste heat from a secondary power coupling, and connected it to a small emergency power cell that was itself connected to nothing else on the ship. He had then apparently simply waited. He had never needed to use it. 3 captains after him had discovered it and said nothing, apparently appreciating the same instinct that had led Embe to build it. Sarah had discovered it in her 4th year on the Leviathan. She had spent 2 weeks quietly restocking it and updating the air recyclers. She had not filed a report. She had told 2 people, her chief engineer and her senior medical officer. When the Verith fleet had dropped out of FTL 11 days ago and opened fire before any communication had been established, before any warning, any ultimatum, any declaration of war, Sarah had been the highest-ranking officer on the ship. The captain was on Callisto Station attending a conference. The executive officer was aboard a logistics tender overseeing resupply. Sarah had been in command for exactly 6 hours when the plasma lances hit. She had run the numbers in about 30 seconds. The Leviathan was crippled. They couldn't fight. They couldn't run. The Breath were sweeping the battlefield and would board any intact vessel. A standard evacuation would put every single crew member in Breath hands within hours. But Becky's compartment held 43 people if they were friendly with one another and didn't complain about personal space. She had stood on the bridge with the collision alarm screaming and the hull groaning around her. And she had gotten on the ship wide, and she had told the crew, all 912 of them, what she was doing and why. And she had asked for volunteers who understood they might be in there for a very long time. 400 people had stepped forward. She had chosen the 43 she needed, the 43 whose specific skills represented the best possible combination for what she had in mind. She had then ordered the remaining crew to evacuate in the escape pods, heading for the debris field, hoping the breath would take prisoners. The EDF didn't leave crew behind to die if there was any alternative. And then she had sealed the door and waited for the universe to get quiet. That had been 11 days ago. In the compartment, 43 people existed in a controlled stillness that took extraordinary discipline. They slept in shifts. They ate in silence from the emergency rations Sarah had stockpiled. They communicated by handwriting on a shared tablet that was wiped after each message was read. No talking louder than a whisper. No movement that wasn't necessary. The thermal blankets kept their biosignatures diffuse. Chief Engineer Thomas Reyes was crouched beside Sarah, in the near dark, studying a hand-drawn schematic of the Leviathan's internal systems. He was 41 years old, a compact, methodical man who had been the ship's chief engineer for 6 years, and who had once famously restarted a dead reactor using parts from a kitchen appliance and a detailed memory of a textbook he'd read in his second year of the academy. He communicated in minimal gestures and expressions that Sarah had learned to read precisely. He held up 3 fingers. She nodded. 3 days, give or take, until the tow drones brought the Leviathan into the breath fleet formation, based on the subtle vibration patterns they could feel through the hull. The drones had attached on day 2. Since then, the ship had been moving slowly toward whatever destination the breath intended for her. Sarah looked at the tablet. She had been running numbers on it for days. She hadn't thought about survival in any individual sense for a long time now. That part of her thinking had gone quiet sometime around day 4, replaced by something cleaner and colder. She was thinking about the Leviathan. She was thinking about what 43 people in one very old, very damaged warship could do. She wrote, "We need the reactor." Reyes read it, made a face that clearly communicated the depth of the engineering challenge involved. Then he wrote, "Possible. 90 minutes minimum. They'll see it." Sarah wrote back, "Yes, that's the point." He looked at her for a long moment. Then very slowly, he smiled. She passed the tablet down the line. 42 people read the plan, one by one in the dark. Not one of them objected. The breath fleet moved through space in the triumphant formation their culture had practiced for 8 centuries. The flagship at center, its escort vessels radiating outward in a precise geometric fan. The prize ships and trophy vessels towed behind in a long ceremonial train. It was tradition. It was theater. It was the Dominion's way of announcing itself. The Leviathan occupied the position of highest honor in that train, directly behind the Eternal Sovereign, the most visible trophy, the one that would be photographed and broadcast and celebrated across breath space as the symbol of humanity's defeat. The boarding ceremony had been brief and disappointing. The 2 soldiers who had planted the flag on the Leviathan's bridge had reported a dark, cold, utterly empty command deck. Consoles dark, chairs empty. The captain's station abandoned so abruptly that a coffee mug still sat in its holder, long since frozen solid. They had taken footage, planted the ceremonial standard, and left. The whole thing had taken 11 minutes. The Leviathan was dead. There was nothing to linger over. Osviri had watched the footage 3 times. Something about the abandoned bridge nagged at him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. It was too still, too. In his experience cataloging conquered species, the ships he'd walked through always told a story of panic or desperation. Overturned furniture, dropped equipment, hatches torn off in haste. The Leviathan's bridge looked as though its crew had stood up, walked calmly out the door, and simply not come back. He made a note in his records. Possible anomalous crew evacuation pattern. Recommend secondary sweep of lower decks before display. He sent it to Commander Theon's office. It sat in the queue behind 47 other reports from 47 other prize ships for 63 hours. On the morning of the 64th hour, it became irrelevant. At 03:47 ship standard time with the breath fleet's overnight watch running on skeleton crew and the majority of the flotilla's crew in their sleep cycle, Sarah Voss tapped Tomas Reyes on the shoulder and held up 4 fingers. 4 minutes. He nodded and moved to the access panel at the rear of the compartment, the one that connected through a labyrinthine series of maintenance crawlways to the secondary engineering junction on Deck 11. He had spent the last 3 days quietly, painstakingly, millimeter by millimeter, working on the connections inside that panel, using tools he'd been carrying in his personal kit. He had done it all by touch in the dark, making no sound. The other 42 crew members moved to their positions. Sarah had spent 11 days planning this moment with the obsessive precision of someone who understood she would get exactly one attempt. She knew the Leviathan better than the Vareth did. She knew her systems, her redundancies, her hidden connections, and her unlisted compartments. She also knew something the Vareth, with their 8 centuries of conquest, might have missed. 400-year-old ships were not impressive because of their power. They were impressive because of their layers. Every refitting added systems. Every captain left modifications. Every chief engineer found workarounds. The Leviathan was not a single warship. She was 4 centuries of human problem-solving, stacked inside a single hull. Most of it not on any schematic the Breath had scanned. At Darrow 351, Reyes made a connection in the dark, deep in the Leviathan's hull. The secondary emergency power cell, the one connected to nothing. The one Dawson Umbeki had installed in 2271, and no one had ever removed. Fed current into a junction. The junction fed 6 systems. Those 6 systems fed 12 more. The Leviathan's reactor had been shut down. That would take much longer to restart, and was not yet the plan. But the Leviathan had other things. On the Breath flagship Eternal Sovereign sensor deck, an alert tone sounded. The Night Watch officer, a young Breath named Sarah Olvin, looked at her console and felt a cold prickle of something she couldn't name. The prize ship was emitting a power signature. Not the reactor that remained cold, but there was power moving through the hull of the Leviathan. Moving deliberately, purposefully, she tagged it as a priority alert and reached for her command line. On the Leviathan, in corridors that had been dark for 11 days, emergency lighting flickered on. Dim red battle stations lighting, the kind that consumed almost nothing and illuminated just enough. 43 people moved through their ship in that red, dark, fast and silent, going to places they had memorized in their heads during 11 days of stillness. Sarah moved to the auxiliary control station on Deck 4. Not the bridge, not where anyone would expect command to originate, but a redundant station installed during the 2156 refit after the Leviathan had lost her bridge crew at Europa and continued fighting for 6 hours under auxiliary control. She settled into the chair, pulled up what system she had, and began to work. The Leviathan could not fight, not yet. Her main battery was cold. Her primary targeting systems were offline. Her engines were dead. But Dawson and Becky had been a thorough man. The Leviathan's communication systems came online. Not just the standard EDF communication band. The Leviathan was 400 years old. She carried communication equipment from eras of Earth's history that predate most of the currently standardized protocols. Buried in her comm array was hardware that could broadcast on frequencies no current breath scanner was specifically calibrated to monitor, because those frequencies were in modern military parlament obsolete. They were obsolete because no one used them anymore, except the EDF's emergency beacon network, which had been built to survive exactly the kind of scenario the human fleet had just experienced, and which received on every frequency ever used by an Earth Defense Force vessel, including the ones that had gone out of regular service 2 centuries ago. Sarah Voss opened a channel on a frequency that hadn't been used since 2201, and she talked. She talked fast, and she talked precisely. And she included coordinates and ship status and fleet composition, and everything she had been cataloging through 43 sets of ears and eyes pressed against the hull of a dead ship for 11 days. She talked for 4 minutes and 12 seconds, which was exactly as long as it took the Breathwatch officer to triangulate her signal and realize it was coming from inside the Leviathan. By then, she was done. She closed the channel, looked at the ceiling, and said quietly to no one in particular, "Great-Grandma, I hope that's what you meant." On the sensor deck of the Eternal Sovereign, Sarah Olvin was shouting for the commander. Commander Theon arrived on the command deck, still pulling on his uniform, moving with a velocity that made his staff instinctively step back. His eyes went immediately to the sensor display, and what he saw there stopped him cold for exactly 1 second. The Leviathan was active, not fully, not her engines, not her weapons, not her shields, but her systems were coming online in sequence, one by one, in the methodical and unhurried way of a crew that knew their ship and was in no particular hurry about it. The communication array, navigation sensors, damage control stations, each one flickering to life like a candle being lit in a dark room. "Life signs," he said, and it was not a question. 43, Sierra Ulven said. Her voice was admirably controlled. "Lower decks, Commander." Deck 7. It appears they were thermal signature is consistent, with a weeks-long inhabitation, but diffuse, distributed. We read it as residual heat from the plasma impacts. Theon stared at the display for a long, silent moment. 43 humans on a ship he had been towing for 11 days, through the heart of his fleet formation, on a ship that had just spent the last 4 minutes broadcasting on a frequency his scanners had flagged, but not prioritized, because it was archaic and supposedly disused. "What did they transmit?" he asked. The signals officer didn't meet his eyes. "Fleet composition, weapon classifications, FTL course projections, current position, heading, speed, detailed breakdowns of every ship in the formation." A pause. "Commander, if anyone received that transmission, I know what it means," Theon said. He knew with the certainty of a commander who had fought humans for 6 years exactly what it meant. He had been outmaneuvered, not by a fleet, not by a strategic genius with 100 ships at his back, but by 43 people in a box, breathing slowly and waiting. "Options," he said. "We can board her now. They'll have internal defenses active within minutes. The tow drones. They can cut the tow drones. They have damage control stations online. Look." He pointed at the sensor feed where the Leviathan's readout was still steadily changing. "Systems coming up." The humans were using their head start. "At what rate is she restoring function?" The signals officer ran numbers. His expression shifted to something deeply uncomfortable. "Commander, the emergency power cell they're running off is small, but it's feeding into pre-existing system connections in a pattern that suggests someone mapped this out in advance. The restoration sequence is too clean to be improvisation. They planned this." Of course they planned it, Theon thought. Of course they had sat in that box for 11 days, and they had planned this. He felt for the first time in 6 years of fighting humans, the specific cold sensation of genuine respect, colliding headlong with genuine alarm. "Get a boarding team to the Leviathan now," he said. "Full combat complement. And someone calculate how far that transmission could have reached, and whether anyone was positioned to receive it." He did not voice the follow-up calculation that he had been broadcasting his own fleet position via the Leviathan's presence in his formation for 11 days. To anyone who cared to track of Wreath Trophy fleet transit route, he suspected the humans had already thought of that. 11 days was a long time to think. On the Leviathan, Sarah Voss was not wasting a second. The boarding team would be on their way now. She had perhaps 8 minutes before the first breath soldiers reached the Leviathan's outer hull. That was fine. She didn't need them to not board her. She needed something different. "Reyes," she said. She was speaking now, no longer keeping silence, no longer the ghost in the machine. Her voice in the empty corridor felt strange, like something that had been stored and was now being let out. "Reactor status." His voice came back over the internal comm. "Also live now. Also running off in Becky's power cell. 18 minutes to cold start minimum, and it'll light up their sensors like a flare. Do it. Start the clock." She looked at the screen in front of her. "How many tow drones?" 6 attached points. I can cut 4 with damage control charges. The other 2 are on the primary hull. I'd rather not blow those. Unless cut all 6, she said. A pause. "That'll really light up their sensors." "Yes, it will." Another pause. Then starting reactor sequence, cutting drone connections in 30 seconds. Sarah pulled up the weapons board. The main battery was still cold, minutes away from any sort of readiness. But the Leviathan was 400 years old, and she had redundancies on her redundancies. And buried in the Deck 3 armory were 6 autonomous point defense pods that drew off a completely separate power system installed in 2301 as an anti-drone measure that had been missed in the Veer initial scan because they were designed specifically to have no power signature whatsoever until activated. She activated them. The breath-boarding shuttles currently crossing the 200-meter gap between the Eternal Sovereign and the Leviathan encountered automated point defense fire approximately 90 seconds earlier than anyone on the Eternal Sovereign had calculated was possible. Commander Theon watched 2 shuttles peel away and heard the damage reports coming in and felt the shape of the situation crystallizing around him with horrible clarity. The Leviathan was not being recovered. The Leviathan was being operated by 43 people with a plan they had spent 11 days refining, using systems the Breath hadn't known existed. And with every passing minute, she was getting more dangerous, not less. Power spike, the sensor officer said. Commander, her reactor just went to start sequence. Theon looked at the display. The Leviathan's power signature, which had been a whisper, was climbing. Still small, she was nowhere near operational capacity, but the trajectory of that climb was unmistakable. She was waking up. How long until she's weapons hot? He asked. The pause before the answer was not reassuring. At current restoration rate, 12 minutes for partial battery, 6 minutes for close-range defensive guns, and our boarding team, 4 minutes out. If the point defense, she has 6 pods. Theon said he had done the math. She can hold a boarding approach for approximately 6 minutes before. Commander, the voice was quiet from the back of the command deck. The communications officer. Sir, incoming contacts. FTL emergent signatures bearing 274 multiple. A pause that stretched for exactly 3 seconds too long. It's human. Earth Defense Force transponders. Commander, it's a lot of them. Theon turned very slowly to look at the display. The transmission had been received. The human fleet came out of FTL in a formation that the Breath Tactical Database had no record of, because it had never been used before. It had been, in fact, improvised by Admiral Yusef Carr in the 12 hours since he had received Sarah Voss's transmission on a frequency he hadn't expected to hear again in his lifetime. In the bunker on Ganymede, where the remnants of the Earth Defense Force were licking their wounds and trying to figure out how to tell 9 billion people that they had lost, the transmission had arrived, like a gift from a past century, in the voice of a woman he knew, precise and calm and packed with intelligence he had not had, and it had told him exactly where the Breath Fleet was, what it was carrying, and most importantly, that the Leviathan was not dead. He had launched within the hour. The formation was aggressive, calculated to exploit the specific weaknesses in Breath Fleet geometry that Sarah's transmission had identified. The blind spots created by the trophy train's configuration, the tow cable angles that restricted the escort vessel's firing arcs, the precise position of each ship. Kara was a careful man in most circumstances. He was not careful now. The Breath Fleet designed for parade formation rather than combat formation scrambled. The Leviathan, with partial reactor power, with 2 gun turrets online, with 43 crew members, running systems that normally required 900 fired for the first time in 11 days. Her guns were old. Her targeting was running off backup processors. Her power allocation was being managed by 1 engineer and a lot of creative wiring. Her accuracy at this range against a moving target with partial power was considerably below her rated specifications. She still hit the Eternal Sovereign twice in 40 seconds. 400 years of hull plating of lessons learned in the Kepler War and the Siege of Europa and 36 other engagements that most of the Breath Fleet hadn't known had happened. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't precise, but it was real. And it was aimed with the specific anger of a crew that had been waiting 11 days in the dark for the chance to express themselves. Commander Theon, watching his flagship shudder under impacts from a ship that had been a trophy 20 minutes ago, made a decision. He had been fighting humans for 6 years. He was not at core a stupid being. All ships, he said, disengage formation, pull back, a pause, and release the Leviathan. His executive officer stared at him. Commander, release her, Theon said. She is no longer a prize. He looked at the display where the old ship was burning in space, half-lit, mismatched power signatures spiking as her crew coaxed more and more function out of her battered systems. She never was. The Breath Fleet, stripped of the trophy formation that had made it a clean target, was faster and more maneuverable than its current configuration suggested. They pulled back well, a trained fleet retreating in order, minimizing losses. Kara's force harried them for 40 minutes, before the Breath reached FTL insertion range and vanished. The battle of what humanity would later call Leviathan's Wake lasted 53 minutes in total, from the first weapons exchange to the Breath jump. It was, by the metrics of the war that followed, a modest engagement. No capital ships destroyed on either side, losses manageable, territory not definitively claimed. But it was not, in any sense, a modest moment when the Leviathan's main airlock finally cycled open and Admiral Kara's shuttle docked. He walked through corridors that still smelled of recycled air and emergency rations, and 43 people living in very close proximity for a very long time. The emergency lighting was still the only illumination. Full power was still hours away. The hull creaked and groaned, leaking heat and gas through her 100 small wounds. He found Sarah Voss in the auxiliary control station on Deck 4, still in the chair she had been sitting in when she opened the channel, now running targeting calculations for the gun turrets that her crew was manually reloading somewhere below. She looked up when he came in. She looked like she hadn't slept properly in 11 days, because she hadn't, and she looked like she wasn't going to start anytime soon. "Admiral," she said. "Commander," he said. He looked around the small, battered compartment. "You look terrible." "I've been in a box," she said. "Sir?" He sat down in the only other chair. For a moment, neither of them said anything, because there wasn't much to say that wasn't obvious. "You should have evacuated," he said finally. Not a criticism, an acknowledgement. "I know," she said, but she still had crew. She looked at the bulkhead where a crack ran from a plasma impact 3 weeks old, now sealed with repair foam. "She always has crew." Kara looked at the crack in the wall. He thought about the transmission arriving on a dead frequency, precise as a surgical instrument. He thought about 43 people sharing air in a compartment built by a paranoid engineer in 2271 who had never needed to use it, waiting for the moment to matter. He thought about the Leviathan, 400 years old, battered and leaking and half-powered, taking shots at the Breath flagship from a position of complete disadvantage, and hitting anyway, because the person behind the targeting system knew every quirk of every backup processor, and loved the ship she was fighting with the specific love of someone who had been born to it. "The Breath will be back," he said. "I know," said Sarah. "The ship needs weeks of repair before she's combat ready." "I know. And you need sleep. When we're done." She looked at him in the dim red light. She looked for just a moment, exactly like the photograph of Petty Officer First Class Marin Voss that hung in the Leviathan's crew gallery, taken in 2143, in the engine room, after the ship came home from Europa. Same eyes, same set of the jaw, same expression of someone who has considered the odds and found them insufficient cause to stop. Kara stood. He had a fleet to regroup and a war to continue planning, and he was running on too little sleep himself. But he paused at the door and looked back. "The Breath called her a trophy," he said. Saraveos looked at the cracked wall of her ship, at the repair foam and the red light, and the scratched nameplate above the console that someone had engraved in 2089, and no one had ever replaced, because it said in letters worn almost smooth with age. "Uses Leviathan. We do not yield." "She was never a trophy," she said. The old ship creaked around them, settling into the dark of space. Her reactor climbing slowly toward full power, her crew already moving through her corridors with wrenches and patch kits, and the quiet, purposeful energy of people who have more work to do. Far away, in the Breath Dominion's Hall of Conquered Peoples, a space had been cleared. Hollow projections of the Leviathan already lined the antechamber, ready to be installed. That space would remain empty for a very long time.